Is America headed for demise? I mean, we're seeing skyrocketing inflation, the crime rate is way up. We're seemingly marching ourselves into World War with several nations around the globe. What is going to happen to us? With us now is Caleb Maupin. He recently wrote the book, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. Caleb, I'm very interested. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Sure, glad to be here.
Marxism, MAGA, and the coming revolution. What do Marxism and MAGA have to, are you saying that is one against the other? Are they the same? What is your position on that?
Well, essentially, I'm using Marxist analysis to explain where the United States is going and why we are facing a crisis. And I argue it's rooted in a long term economic fallout, and then that gives rise to divisions among our ruling class. But part of the reason I gave it that provocative title is because when I was a college student, I remember I had a professor, an older man who had lived in both Vietnam and China, spoke both languages fluently. And I remember he one time took me aside and he said to me, Caleb, American communists have no idea what they're talking about, right? And he told me very provocatively, he said if Mao were alive and living in the United States, he would go to the poorest corner of Appalachia and start some kind of George Washington Bible gun club. And I heard that and I was like, what is he talking about? What in the world is he getting at? And it took me years. I was part of Occupy Wall Street, and then I started traveling internationally. I visited Venezuela a number of times. I've been to the Islamic Republic of Iran. I've been to global communist gatherings in Sochi, Russia, and in Ecuador, the World Festival of Youth and Students. And I've realized that what we consider to be leftism in the United States of America has nothing to do with what Marxism is around the world. And that what's happening right now with Donald Trump, with the events of January 6th, is the beginning of a process. When you enter a long term economic and political crisis as a society, when the elite start fighting against each other, they start bringing people into politics to kind of battle each other on their behalf. And it's that kind of process that gives birth to the kind of events that we've seen in the 20th century with socialist revolutions. And that many leftists in the United States, when it really gets down to it, are just kind of defenders of the status quo at this point. They're defending the FBI, they're defending the wars, etc. However, there are a layer of Americans who are struggling economically, who want the country to have an economic reboot. And many of them are supporters of Donald Trump. There's a meme on the internet. They talk about MAGA communism. And now, I don't fully embrace that brand. That's not my brand exactly. But I would say this book is the closest thing that has yet been published to a MAGA communist manifesto. Because I argue that the tendencies and the trends in U.S. society that gave birth to Donald Trump and MAGA are the tendencies that could potentially give birth to a real, genuine socialist movement in America. And that the left, or the so-called left, is not putting its energy and paying attention and focused in the right way.
I think it's going to be a hard sell, I would think, for MAGA people to embrace Marxism. Is that what you're getting at?
Not at all. What I'm saying is that America, the United States, is facing a long term society wide crisis. And this kind of crisis is rooted in the economic foundations of society. And it is leading us to political turmoil that could potentially give birth to a genuine socialist movement. And what we call the left in the United States is not that. In the book, I talk about Zbigniew Brzezinski and how he wrote a very important book during the 1970s, the technotronic era he started referring to. And basically, he argued that the 1960s New Left was not a danger of communist revolution or anything like that. Rather, it was a cultural reaction to the changes in society that were happening as a result of the information revolution. And he argued that rather than fight against the New Left, the civil rights movement, the anti Vietnam War protest movement, the counterculture, rather the energy there could be hijacked and utilized against the communist bloc, right? And we saw that with the color revolutions. And he argued that with the information revolution and putting the United States at the center of the computer revolution, what could happen was the world could be, quote unquote, Americanized. And the ideology of liberalism, not liberal as in left or versus right, but rather liberal as in individualism above all else, rejecting any collective identity. The American notion of individualism could be universalized throughout the world. And that is what we have really seen. The world has been Americanized, and the USA was victorious in the Cold War. The communist bloc was largely brought down. And we've seen the Americanization of the world, and we've seen the computer revolution, but it has only amplified deep problems in our economic and political system, to the point that we are seeing the breakdown of society. And I compare it to the fall of the Roman Empire. And ultimately, there is going to be some kind of reckoning. The United States is going to have to move to some form of illiberalism in order to survive. But what kind of illiberalism will that be? That's what I get into in the text.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess I should ask you first, what is leftism then? What is the US's version of leftism versus what you would consider to be leftism?
Well, the terms left and right, historically, it comes out of the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, the king was brought down, and they formed a National Assembly. And the people in the National Assembly who were more sympathetic to the king sat on the right, and the more radical forces that wanted to march into the future and be modern, they sat on the left. And that's where the connotation came from. So what does leftism really mean? It kind of just means historical progress, the desire to advance, whatever that means. Now, what's interesting, though, is we saw in the United States, there was, you had the Communist Party during the 1930s that were big supporters of Roosevelt, that mobilized against fascism, built the labor movement, were key in bringing up the issue of civil rights. But after the Second World War, you saw McCarthyism and the breakup of the Communist Party. The Communist Party was significantly weakened. But you also saw the CIA, the American Central Intelligence Agency, launch a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, where they started subsidizing socialist and left-wing publications to push forward a message that was against the Soviet Union that would be useful to American intelligence. And many of the big left-wing names of that period, Susan Sontag, Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt, and others, came out of the CIA covertly propping them up. Magazines like Partisan, Review, Encounter, Der Monat, when they talk about the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, these individuals were being promoted, and this is fact. I mean, this is documented. I mean, this is factually acknowledged by the CIA itself. They began promoting certain leftist personalities. But those leftist personalities they were promoting, not only were they against the Soviet Union and against China, they framed leftism in the terms of radical individualism. It was about the intellectuals versus the mob. And it was really an extension of what began with Friedrich Nietzsche, what was continued with Ayn Rand and others, the teachings of Leo Strauss, what can be called philosophical irrationalism, which is the belief that there is no real truth, that when it really gets down to it, it's just kind of a law of the jungle scenario out there. And the people, the broad masses of people, the working class, are very dangerous, because if they get together, they'll threaten the great intellectuals and their freedom. And that kind of thinking, philosophical irrationalism, anti-populism, that became synonymous with leftism. And in the United States, that's really what leftism has become. It is almost like teenage Satanism, right? In the United States, if you don't like your parents, you don't like the government, you don't like your teachers, you study the enemy ideology. You study communism because you're against society. That's not what it is in the former Soviet Union. That's not what it is in China today. It's a very different thing, right? It's very much these societies trying to grow. And the emphasis in the socialist societies, with Stalin, with his 5-year plans, the emphasis in China, especially since the Deng era, with socialism with Chinese characteristics, is on economic growth. And leftism being synonymous with historical progress, that would make sense. The idea is to build and advance. And Karl Marx envisioned his ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world as being based on vast material abundance, so much wealth existing that the need for any kind of government coercion or any social hierarchies would fade away. But the basis of it was vast abundance. But now what we hear coming out of leftist circles is the opposite. We hear this notion that wealth is bad, that growth is somehow bad, that primitive things are somehow beautiful, that we need to get back to nature, we need to get back to things. That's not really a leftist message, but that is what is prevailing in the United States. But it is a message that is very much supported by the elite. And so left-wing politics has been kind of reinvented over the course of the Cold War. And in many ways, when you look at the countries right now that are run by communists or socialists or Marxists, they seem somewhat conservative. You know, Nicaragua, a socialist government led by the Sandinistas, has some of the strictest anti-abortion laws in the world. And I know you've talked about some of your experiences with your family in Vietnam and elsewhere, that socialism as a political movement led by Marxist, Leninist, communist parties has become somewhat conservative. Whereas leftism and the revolutionary energy that kind of defines leftist politics in the West has very much been hijacked by the Western elite. And we talk about George Soros and the color revolutions, that kind of desire to tear things down, that libidinal release that seems to be behind a lot of leftist politics is something that is very much hijacked by the tech monopolies and other forces to push their agenda around the world and target governments they don't like. So the political compass has really been broken. We don't really know what's left and right. But what we do know is the Western countries are in a big crisis right now. Meanwhile, Russia and China are rising, Iran is rising, the Bolivarian countries of Latin America are rising, and there is an alternative economy that is emerging in which they have a different perspective.
It's interesting. I like that you're divorcing the social stuff from the economic stuff, because I think that's where things get really muddy, is when you say, okay, if you're a leftist economically, then you also must be liberal in many other aspects. So socially liberal. And in this country, one thing that I always find so interesting is the fact that the two sides, the conservatives and the liberals, are actually so confused. You can't really call liberals liberal, and you can't call conservatives conservatives. We have an idea, we have an understanding of the term in this country, but when you actually look at what the term means and how the parties are then, or how people are then assigned to these, it doesn't quite make sense. Like, the left is considered liberal. They might be liberal socially, but not liberal so much economically. Conservatives are quite liberal economically, actually, but many of them are not liberal socially. Libertarians are really the only group of people that I would say are ideologically consistent. And libertarians, but where it doesn't get consistent is libertarians are lumped in with conservatives, when in actuality, libertarians are the extreme liberal group in America. They are liberal on every front and should be considered liberals. They are, I would say, the antithesis of what liberal is. They're very liberal socially. They say, yeah, live and let live, do what you want to do. I don't care about all these different social questions. And they're also economically very liberal, where they just say, live and let live, let government, get government out and let businesses do whatever businesses want to do. So, but I don't know if we have the same, maybe I'm not thinking it through thoroughly, but do we have a conservative, economically conservative, and socially conservative group in America? That almost sounds like what you're almost proposing in some ways. I mean, that would almost be like Nicaragua in a way.
I think it's very interesting that Donald Trump's recent speech about the quantum leap emphasized that he was going to build new model cities, because you know what country has been doing that for years? That's China.
Yeah.
I mean, that was
Yeah.
Deng Xiaoping. That's what he was famous for, was building model cities. And Xi Jinping just recently built the Saigon New area as a model city, right? And that is something very much that the socialist bloc has emphasized, this notion that the duty of the leader is to oversee economic growth and control the means of production to make sure that living standards continue to rise. That is very much a Marxian concept. And that seems to be what a lot of Trump's base wants to hear from him, whether they would put it that way or not. The other thing that I think is interesting is on the right now, there's a lot of anger at globalism. That is the target, is globalism. And globalism, that is very much, that's capitalism. That's the rule of the world by these huge multinational corporations. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, Marx spends the first several pages talking about how all the things that are important to conservatives, like the family, like tradition, like loyalty to one's country, are being destroyed. He's writing this back in 1848 by capitalism. And he says they're leaving nothing but the remaining nexus of between man and man, callous self-interest, callous cash payment. I mean, many ways you could argue that global capitalism in our time is very, very radical and liberal, and it is something that conservatives are very upset by, right? And when they rant against big banks and big corporations, when Trump says we should put America first, he's kind of yelling and challenging, at least in words, an economic order that is very much what Vladimir Lenin wrote about when he wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, describing the move from industrial capital to the rule of the world by big banks that essentially hold back development across the planet. And the whole essence of what Lenin was writing when he wrote about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was he was saying that, the Western capitalist countries are holding back the ability of Africa and Asia and Latin America to raise their people out of poverty, to develop. And if you look at the communist revolutions that happened throughout the 20th century, they were largely countries like Vietnam, countries like China, countries in Africa, countries in South America, breaking out of this Western financial system and then taking control of their own economies and industrializing very rapidly, building power plants, building schools, electrifying the country, building their own steel industries. And it was kind of a revolt in a way that Donald Trump might put it, as a revolt against globalism. So the way we think about politics in the United States is very, very wrong and very confused. And I argue that what's happening with Trump is the beginning of a process. As American society continues to be less and less stable, as living standards are dropping, the elite are fighting with each other, sections of the elite are bringing working people and average people into politics as their foot soldiers. And that is the kind of thing that could potentially lead to, whether it's some kind of socialist society in the United States, or it could lead to some kind of very dangerous form of fascism. And I talk about that in the book as well. But I would argue at this point, the fascism is coming from the woke left. Because if you look at the economics of fascism, the main focus of fascism in terms of economics is rebooting the economy by driving down living standards. That's the essence of what Hitler did in Germany. That's the essence of what Mussolini did in Italy. It was reducing living standards, creating an underclass of slave laborers, driving down consumption on the part of the population in order to reboot the economy. And that is what many of the leftist voices in the United States are openly advocating doing. They want a more tightly controlled economy, and they openly say, in the name of opposing climate change, etc., that they want to forcibly degrow. And that is the essence of fascist economics.
Yeah, I agree with you that we are on the brink of something. And I agree with you that the MAGA people out there are very much wanting change, right? They're seeing all the problems, they're feeling all the problems, and they want change. I just think that the problem that I'm seeing, and I understand, and I hear what you're explaining. I think it's kind of mind bending for a lot of people because we do use certain terms in this country that mean certain things that are, like I said, are not necessarily actually connected, or they shouldn't be connected. One of those things, so when you talk about a socialist economic revolution, obviously I think anybody who's MAGA is going to reject it outright if it contains the term socialist in any way, shape, or form, right? So you've got this, what we'd be dealing with is you're going to have two groups coming from both sides of the aisle wanting radical economic change, as we've seen more and more disaster happen here with our inflation, with the economy, with all of these things that are going on. People are going to demand the change. Then we're going to end up in a war of words with each other, essentially. Maybe MAGA people do want the exact same things as what somebody who would say, well, that's going more towards a socialist economic society. I myself am a big proponent of the Scandinavian models. I really prefer the way the Scandinavian countries have balanced both capitalism and socialism in a way that works, I think, where people are still motivated to innovate, companies are still able to make billions of dollars, but people are also very cared for and happy, and they are given the freedom by not having to worry about things like how they're going to pay for their elderly, their aging parents, or how they're going to pay for childcare, or how they're going to pay for medical bills, or how they're going to pay for college. They don't have those concerns, so they're actually given freedom to go out there and innovate in the world because they're not bogged down with all the stress. It's a big, appealing way of, economic structure for me. But if I were to say to somebody who's coming from the right and who's traditionally, conservative, and maybe now they're MAGA conservative, they would say, no way, I don't want anything to do with any socialism. I just want the government out of my business, or they won't even really know what they want. They just know they don't want socialism and they don't want what's happening now. So I think that there's going to be an issue because we've weaponized so many words and so many terms that I don't know how we'd ever come to an agreement, which almost means we are doomed for a fascist revolution. I mean, that to me is almost the only place this lands us, which is really my big concern, is that if you cannot come to consensus as a people, if you cannot agree, we know, for example, from polling that most Americans want some form of Medicare for all, but if you call it Medicare for all, they don't want it. It needs to be framed with a entirely new word or new phrase in order for people to accept it. So my concern is because people won't be able to come to an agreement, which I do think is probably manufactured by the elites. They've done this on purpose, demonized certain words so that people will never latch onto them. That the only thing left would be, unfortunately, a fascist revolution where there's tight controls on the people, tight controls on everything. That's almost, I don't know if there's any other way around that. But you're saying, I mean, you seem more hopeful. You
Well,
seem more
at
hopeful
this
that there's a
point,
different way.
I'm hopeful because if you pay attention to the divide among the American elite, Carol Quigley, who I quote in the book, who was like a mentor to Bill Clinton, talked about how during the Cold War, the fight in American politics was between the lower levels of capital, many of whom were tied in with the military-industrial complex that were conservative, and the Eastern establishment, the big oil companies that tended to be a little more liberal, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, and others. And that was the push and pull. And we've entered a period now where it seems like because of Silicon Valley, that Eastern establishment, the ultra rich, have gotten the upper hand. And they are very much pushing things in a more quote unquote liberal direction. But they have resolved that the way to solve the economic crisis is to reduce consumption and to kind of transition the United States to a post industrial society. Whereas those lower levels of capital, that are a lot of which are tied into the military, they still believe in economic growth. They just want to make money. They don't appreciate, being restrained, et cetera. The thing is, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, all those countries also want to grow. And so there is a common interest there. And it's very interesting to me that some of the main anti-war voices, or the people that have been the harshest critics of U.S. foreign policy in recent years, have come out of the military. Tulsi Gabbard is a great example of that. And we saw how Michael Flynn was forced out of the Trump administration. And it seems like there are many folks in the military and many folks in that military sector of the U.S. economy who just don't really like the idea of an endless confrontation with our geopolitical rivals, but instead would be interested in an economic reboot of the country in possible coordination with those countries that are pulling themselves up out of poverty and have, Marxist or socialist leaders. So we're entering this odd period where the layer of U.S. society that was the most hawkish and right-wing during the Cold War is now more sympathetic to forces around the world, whereas the Eastern establishment is in this hawkish mode to try and defend a dying financial system. They're trying to defend, the Wall Street, London, global economic order that is just falling apart. But there is a real economy in the United States. It's based on building things, physical economy. And that physical economy would have more to gain by trading with Russia and China and doesn't have much to gain in the long term from a real war. They might make money in the short term by selling weapons, but a real all-out war with China or with Russia is not a war that's going to end very well for the human race, and we all know that. So we're entering a period where I do believe that the layer of U.S. society that wants economic growth, as well as the millions of working class people in this country who, as you said, do want Medicare for all, do want their lives to get better, don't accept the notion that they should just be poorer because that's what Mother Earth needs, or that's just the way the world is. They don't appreciate seeing their living standards go down. We could see some kind of strange alliance emerge out of all of this. In the book, I talk about the Chinese flag, for example. The Chinese flag, if you look at the flag, there's the big star, and that's for the Communist Party, but then there's 4 small stars, and that represents the block of 4 great classes. That was the peasants, the workers, the small farmers, and the national capitalists, who were aligned behind the Communist Party on the basis of building a new China, breaking China out of the Western financial domination. And it was not originally a communist communist revolution in China. They called it a new democratic revolution under the leadership of the Communist Party. And that these kind of alliances happen. I talk about how ultimately what was the turning point in the Chinese Revolution was the Golden Yuan. It was that the Chiang Kai-shek confiscated the gold of all the richest people in China and gave them a paper currency for it. And that paper currency crashed and they lost all their money. And at that moment, many of the richest people in China said, well, anyone's got to be better than Chiang Kai-shek. And they went over to support Mao Zedong. And that was the turning point. And there were millionaires in China up into the 50s who never had their property confiscated or anything, because at that point they considered themselves to be in what they called the new democratic phase of the Chinese Revolution. It's very interesting to look at this history. And often it is alliances between the elite, between different factions battling for power, that give birth to new earth-shaking changes like the revolutions we saw in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. And I definitely think we need to be looking at new ways to shake up our economic system so that it is fair for all. I'm not a fan of communism. My family did have land and confiscated by the communist government. So, I come from a different perspective on that for sure, that it did happen to some people and they were forced out of their homes. But that doesn't necessarily go hand in hand. There's a lot of, as I mentioned, breaking up of concepts. People tend to lump everything into one, saying if you're economically conservative, you must also be religiously conservative, or you must be, XYZ things. And they don't all need to go together. I do think that there's a way to go forward. But it's a very complex topic, Caleb. I mean, you're tackling something very difficult, to be honest, very difficult. And the idea that there are social conservatives who are in line with a socialist, even if you don't, it's like dangerous to use that word, but we're going to have to use it because what other word do we have? But a socialist type of economy, I think that exists. That definitely exists, as you pointed to examples of this. So it's fascinating that there could be this coming revolution that is almost triggered by the MAGA people in a lot of ways. That's
I would argue
interesting.
that they are a symptom of the crisis that we are in, and our
Right.
elites are fighting with each other. And at the end of the day, most Americans don't want World War III, and most Americans want economic growth. They want their living conditions to get better. And at this point, I think it's only a matter of time before sections within the elite that can promise that and deliver on that begin to mobilize the population. And as the elite begin fighting for each other, that creates an opening for the people to assert what it is that they really want. And that's the process through which revolutions actually happen. They're not created from thin air. And that's what I argue in my book.
Caleb, always fascinating chatting with you. You're always so knowledgeable. Thank you for being here. And where can people get your book?
Oh, it's available on Amazon. I also I work with the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. That's where we publish a lot of material, putting forward interesting perspectives on global events.
Okay, well, where's America headed? That's where's America going? That's what we need to definitely be thinking about, I think, for sure. So, Caleb, thank you so much.
Thank you.